I've been in senior national security positions for on and off over the last 17 years, and for that whole period of time, Cuba has been trying to do everything it could to destabilize parts of the region.
At the beginning of the 1990s, after the fall of the Soviet Union, Fidel Castro conceived and created a leftist, anti-U.S. Latin American organization that held its first meeting in Sao Paulo, Brazil. The organization then became known as the Sao Paulo Forum. Members of the forum now are Ignacio Lula da Silva of Brazil, Colonel Hugo Chavez of Venezuela, Daniel Ortega, the Nicaraguan Sandinista, Shafiq Handal of El Salvador's FMLN, the FARC guerrillas of Colombia, and Evo Morales of Bolivia. Many other leftist Latin American organizations also are represented. Several of the members are already presidents of their countries, and others are leaders of important political parties that might soon gain power. In January of this year, the Third Hemispheric Forum, which opposes the free trade area of the Americas, was held in Havana, Cuba, gathering 1,200 activists from 32 countries. In his 6-hour closing speech, Castro urged the Western Hemisphere's anti-FTAA political parties, labor leaders, and leftist intellectuals to employ a variety of tactics in order to bring about a crisis in their respective homelands, citing Venezuela and Argentina as models of what can be done. In their final declaration, they took credit for ousting Gonzalo Sanchez de Lozada from the presidency of Bolivia in 2003. The present political situation in Venezuela is the result of Castro's influence on that nation. There are thousands of Cuban soldiers in Venezuela to support Hugo Chavez and keep him in power. Uruguay denounced the Cuban intelligence service, accusing it of spying on the telephone and email communications in their legislative body. Fidel Castro is responsible for the anti-democratic leftist movements that have destabilized many countries in Latin America. The United States should realize that if Cuba is not liberated soon, Latin America will be lost. Cuba's connection with international terrorism is well documented. It's one of the 7 countries listed by the State Department as a nation that aids and abets terrorism. At the Ibero-American Summit of the year 2000, Castro was the only president who refused to sign a resolution condemning the ETA Basque terrorist organization. For decades, Cuba has been involved in the transshipment of drugs into the United States, and several high-ranking Cuban military officials and diplomats have been indicted by our government. President Bill Clinton revoked an executive order that authorized covert operations to destabilize the Cuban dictatorship. Cuba has placed spy networks in the United States. Some Cuban spies have been arrested, tried, and sentenced. One Cuban spy, Ana Belén Montes, held a very high security position in the Defense Department for a number of years. Admiral Thomas Wilson, head of the Defense Intelligence Agency, explains Cuba's capacity to perform a cyber attack on the United States.
Admiral Wilson, a question for you about Cuba. Is Cuba, in your view, a military threat to the United States?
They have strong intelligence apparatus, good security, and the potential to disrupt our military through asymmetric tactics, and I think that is the biggest threat that they present to our military.
What would be an example of an asymmetric tactic that you're speaking of?
Using information warfare or computer network attack, for example, to be able to disrupt our access or flow of forces to the region.
And you would say that there is a real threat that they might go that route?
There's certainly the potential for them to employ those kind of tactics against our modern and superior military.
On February 24th, 1996, 2 Cuban MiGs attacked and destroyed 2 unarmed civilian airplanes in international waters, killing 4 persons. 3 of them were United States citizens. In a later interview, Fidel Castro accepted responsibility, admitting that he had ordered the attack and destruction of these airplanes. 3 Cuban military officers were indicted by the U.S. government for this unjustified crime. Yet, up until now, no legal proceedings have been initiated against Fidel Castro. In May 2002, while visiting Iran and other Middle East countries, Castro declared that together they would bring the United States to its knees. Former Soviet Colonel Ken Alibek, the ex-deputy chief of the Soviet biowarfare program, tells us about Cuba's incursion into this field.
You know, there are several, let me say, indicators of this program. And some of them from, let me say, from my previous experience, from my previous knowledge, I mean, when I was in the Soviet Union, in Russia, and some additional information I obtained here in the United States. First, for me, some information came from my superiors, and specifically General Kalinin. He was the chief of the main directorate, Biopreparat, and he went to Cuba in 1990, I believe. And he saw some facilities in Cuba, and according to him, at least one of them was very suspicious, and some closed sections, and you know, high level of security. And you know, of course, usually regular biotechnological facilities do not require such a level of security. And another information is just, of course, I can continue this enumeration, but one more piece of information just was published in 1998 by the Defense Intelligence Agency of the United States. And they told that for sure that Cuba had an offensive biological weapons program.
It is truly astonishing that in more than 4 decades, the United States has taken no effective action to rid itself of such a dangerous enemy. In the last 40 years, there have been a great many American military interventions around the world. On April 26, 1965, the United States intervened in the Dominican Republic with around 30,000 soldiers to stop a civil war between different political and military factions. In 1982, American Marines fought and expelled the PLO from Beirut. In 1983, the United States invaded Grenada in response to the violence in that country and to rescue several hundred American students who were on the island. In 1989, the United States, with a force of 27,000 soldiers, invaded Panama and captured General Manuel Noriega, who had been indicted in the United States for narcotics trafficking. Also in 1989, in reprisal for a terrorist attack masterminded by Libya's Omar Gaddafi, American Navy jets bombed Gaddafi's residence. In 1990 and 91, the United States deployed sea, air, and land forces in Operation Desert Storm to force Saddam Hussein to withdraw from Kuwait. In 1992, members of the American Armed Forces fought in Mogadishu, Somalia, to stop a slaughter initiated in that country by a local warlord. Also in 1992, U.S. naval forces staged a blockade of Serbia and Montenegro, which had become independent from Yugoslavia, to stop the killing of Croatians by ethnic Serbians. U.S. warplanes bombed Serbian forces in 1993 in order to stop Slobodan Milosevic's murderous campaign of ethnic cleansing. In 1994, American troops landed in Haiti and naval forces put a blockade in place to restore President Jean-Bertrand Aristide to his post. In 1998, American planes bombed a pharmaceutical plant in Sudan because it was reported they were manufacturing nerve gas to use in wars or terrorist attacks. In 2001, Afghanistan was first bombed and then invaded by United States forces in reprisal for the Taliban government's aid to Osama bin Laden, who planned and bankrolled the terrorist attacks of September 11th. In 2003, Iraq was invaded by a coalition of United States, British, and other forces to put an end to Saddam Hussein's oppressive regime. And this year, United States forces have again moved into Haiti to restore order in that country. Of course, nobody wants another military intervention by the United States, especially now that we're involved in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Haiti. But something must be done to liberate Cuba and free it from the oppressive regime of Fidel Castro.
Well, we should do everything we can to get a democratic government into Cuba, one that respects the rights of the people, that supports a democratic form of government where the government is of, by, and for the people, not of, by, and for one dictator, and a country that offers some hope of a better standard of living and prosperity for its people. None of those things are going to happen as long as Fidel Castro is in power.
President Jose Maria Aznar of Spain recently spoke to a joint session of the U.S. Congress and said that Cuba's government today is an anomaly, not only for Latin America, but also for the whole world.
Como tantos españoles, vengo de una familia con raíces en Cuba. La isla caribeña es una de las últimas anomalías históricas, no ya de las Américas, sino del mundo entero. Quiero reiterar aquí mi deseo y esperanza de dar pronto, muy pronto, a Cuba la bienvenida a la comunidad de las naciones libres del mundo.
But the sad truth is that both Democratic and Republican administrations have decided not to do anything decisive to remove Castro from power and to wait for him to die, thinking that his successor will be more inclined to establish friendly relations with the United States. Senator Graham states his view on Cuba's evident policy regarding closer relations with the United States.
Well, I wish I had a magic bullet that would assure that we could move tomorrow towards a democratic and free Cuba. We've tried it for 40 years and haven't found what that bullet is. So I think we need to continue to do the things that we have been doing, the political and economic isolation of Cuba, to deal harshly when there are any evidences that they may be becoming a security threat to the United States, such as through their development of biological weapons. But the most important thing that we can do is to start the process today to be ready to act aggressively and effectively as soon as Castro is ready to leave the scene, so that we won't have a dictatorial successor.
Fidel Castro is 77 years old, but he comes from a long-lived family. During a Senate Intelligence Committee hearing, in which the three chiefs of the nation's senior intelligence agencies testified, Senator Joseph Biden asked about Castro's health.
What can you tell us again in a public session about the state of Mr. Castro's health, his most likely successor?
I think the DCI probably has better information. I would say if you look at the track record of predicting decline in his health for the last 30 years, it tells you shouldn't go too much further in trying to predict it for the next few years. DCI probably is.
He's got a great gene pool, is all I can say, and I think he's going to be around for a while.
The United States government is waiting for Fidel Castro's demise, which could take 5, 8, 10 years or more. Meanwhile, Castro is subverting democratic regimes in Latin America while continuing to oppress the Cuban people. In March of last year, he arrested, judged, and condemned 75 journalists and dissidents. In these kangaroo trials, some of the accused received sentences of 20 years or more. Castro also ordered the execution by firing squad of 3 desperate young men who were captured while trying to leave the island in search of freedom. Castro has blocked Cubans from internet access and prohibited satellite dishes. He continues to jam radio and TV marquee, all in an effort to keep the Cuban people in ignorance of what is really happening in the outside world. Only the Cuban government has control of the media. No private source of information is permitted. He also uses food rationing as a weapon of political control. On his prison island, Fidel Castro has all the power, and the people who feel a growing sense of helplessness have no rights at all. During his visit to London in November 2003, President George W. Bush said,
"The people have given us the duty to defend them. And that duty sometimes requires the violent restraint of violent men. In some cases, the measured use of force is all that protects us from a chaotic world ruled by force."
Fidel Castro easily qualifies as a violent dictator, but no effective steps have been taken to remove him from power.
I think the only key characteristic, the only key and defining characteristic of Fidel Castro that was not evident at Moncada, it only became evident some years later, was his profound antipathy, his ferocious hatred of the United States.
The food being sold now by the United States to Cuba does not reach the Cuban people. Instead, it goes to hotels for tourists, to stores owned by the government, which only sell for US dollars, and to homes of members of the Communist Party. If the Cuban embargo is lifted, it will not bring democracy to Cuba.
Castro is clinging to an ideology of the past, and as long as that system remains, Cuba will remain poor, undeveloped, and oppressed. Number 2, the second myth is that if the embargo is lifted and the travel ban is lifted, and if we engage the Cuban government and the Cuban people, democracy will follow and things will get better. Well, I submit to you that for 20 or 30 years, the Canadians, the Europeans, the Latin Americans have been engaged with Cuba, have been going to Cuba, tourism have been going to Cuba, and we have as much of a repressive or even worse repressive regime than we had 20 years ago, and the economy is still a disaster.
On a recent television program, President Bush said that even though no weapons of mass destruction were found in Iraq, the fact that they had installations that could make them was reason enough to justify the invasion in view of the danger that this represented to the United States. Professor Jose de la Fuente of the University of Oklahoma, who for 10 years was research director of the Cuban Institute of Genetics and Biotechnology, was asked at a conference about Cuba's technical capacity to produce weapons of mass destruction.
Cuba have invested about over $1 billion in developing an infrastructure for biotechnology. So my short answer will be yes, there are capabilities that could be used in principle for the production of biological food.
If Cuban Americans in the United States try to take any military action against Fidel Castro, they are arrested by the FBI, tried, and sentenced to prison terms. It defies reason and common sense that in more than 40 years, the U.S. government has done nothing effective to liberate Cuba and restore democracy there. Is it because the government is afraid of a new Mariel, a mass exodus of Cubans to the United States? When the boat lift occurred in 1980, President Jimmy Carter had given it a green light. Now there is a red light. No boats are legally allowed to bring people from Cuba, and those who do are punished. What's more, Homeland Security and the U.S. Coast Guard have said that they are more than ready to prevent such an exodus by stopping refugee vessels in international waters. This plan is called Distant Shore, For all these reasons, a new Mariel exodus simply cannot take place. Many treaties agreed to by the members of the Organization of American States and signed by the United States guarantee democracy in the Western Hemisphere. Among those are the Rio Treaty and the Declaration of Chile. Based on these agreements, coexisting with a communist state is immoral, illegal, and unacceptable. What can be done? One step would be to have Radio and TV Marti really penetrate into Cuba. These stations produce excellent programs that should be heard and seen throughout the island. It's inconceivable that the nation that sends 2 rovers to Mars at a cost of at least $1 billion cannot develop a way to reach Cuba effectively. Could it be possible that there is no real interest in having these stations reach the island? Is it because the government is afraid of Castro's retaliation? Is there any other reason? If these stations did reach Cuba effectively, the impact would be such that the Cuban people might finally rise up and get rid of the tyranny that has oppressed them for more than 45 years. Another step would be to continue limiting the remittance of dollars to the island and implement tighter restrictions on travel to Cuba. When an international boycott was put in place against South Africa, it worked, and that country evolved into a democracy. Couldn't the same thing be done with Cuba? Another important step would be to continue helping Castro's opponents on the island, sending them computers, faxes, paper, ink, and above all, cash, which would enable them to continue their crusade for a free Cuba.
Se demuestra una vez más que ellos lo que quieren es destruir la oposición, una oposición digna, de hombres dignos, de mujeres dignas, que a pesar de que pueden ponernos 20 años en la cárcel, estamos aquí presentes y que le vamos a exigir que respete los derechos humanos, le vamos a exigir que libere a los presos políticos.
President Bush has taken important steps to weaken Castro's dictatorship. He has vowed to veto any measure that would lift the embargo. He's instructed the Department of National Security to tighten up on travelers who are carrying more money to Cuba than is legally authorized. He's directed the State Department to restrict or limit permits to visit Cuba. And 3 Cuban military officers have been indicted for the assassination of the 4 Brothers to the Rescue pilots. It's a lot more than any other administration has done, but it's not enough. The truth is that nothing is being done to terminate the Castro dictatorship. As long as this situation continues, the cancer of subversion and hate against the United States will spread in the hemisphere. And only 90 miles away from our shores, millions of Cubans will go on suffering a brutal and oppressive tyranny. Many Cubans have gone to war as members of the United States Armed Forces. They have participated in U.S. invasions and have died in Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq, and other countries where the United States has felt called upon to intervene. They love freedom and democracy and are willing to give their lives if called upon in the service of their adopted country. But a love of the island where they were born continues to burn in their hearts. So they are constantly compelled to ask themselves this one simple, yet seemingly unanswerable question: why not Cuba?